Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our community session, which will provide an overview of the Renewable Energy Zones, or REZs, in Western Victoria. My name is Catherine. I'm the Major Developments Community Engagement Officer at Renewable Shire Council, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that make up Renewable Shire, the Wadawurrung, Wurundjeri and Dja Dja Wurrung peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We are running this session virtually from our own homes, so please bear with us if any technical difficulties come up. Our hope is that this session will empower our community members and provide some valuable information on how they can contribute to planning for future renewable energy infrastructure in Victoria. We'll begin this session with a presentation from our expert guest, Ben Ferguson, that addresses many of the questions that we've received from the community in the lead up to this session. After that, we'll have the opportunity for live Q&A with those of you who are tuned in. Your microphones are muted, but you can submit your questions via the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll try to address as many of them as possible, but we ask that you please keep in mind that any project-specific questions about the Western Victoria Transmission Network project should be directed to AusNet Services, and we can help facilitate that offline. Otherwise, Ben will respond as best he can from the Renewable Energy Zone project perspective. So on that note, let's get to it. I am delighted to welcome back Ben Ferguson, Director of the Renewable Energy Zones Development Branch at the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome everyone. Thank you for the kind words of being an expert panelist, Catherine. I don't think I've ever been described as that.
You're more than welcome.
I'll give it a go. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I meet with you today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So I'm going to give a presentation today on the Victorian Government's Renewable Energy Zone Development Work Agenda. But before I kind of get into it, I think it's probably worthwhile spending a bit of time actually defining what we talk about when we talk about REZs in Victoria. And I'll be using the word REZs from now on, Renewable Energy Zones, REZs. REZs are areas of rich renewable energy resources such as wind, sun, water, etc., that are well placed to develop large-scale renewable energy generation assets as we transition away, from fossil fuel-based generation. The REZ development agenda in Victoria acknowledges this and sees it as an opportunity to better coordinate the development of generation and network infrastructure in Victoria in a way that minimises the impact on communities associated with the development, but also hopefully leverages opportunities for local economic development and community development as well. So if that's kind of the REZ as a concept, it probably is also worth talking a bit about what aren't REZs as well, and the fact that when we are talking about REZs, we're not talking about everything to do with renewable energy in Victoria. So the Victorian Government doesn't believe that REZs are the be-all and end-all of renewable energy development in Victoria. We acknowledge that there is likely to be large-scale renewable energy development in areas that may occur outside of REZs in Victoria, as there already are. And we also recognise that the transition to renewable energy in Victoria will occur in a variety of different ways at a variety of different scales. What ultimately we want to get to is a resilient grid that can deliver cheap, renewable and clean energy in Victoria. And we see REZs as an important, but not the only part of that transition. So with that in place, I might move to the next slide, Catherine. So these are the objectives of our work agenda in Victoria around the development of REZs. Now, as you can see, these concepts are probably bigger than being heard, but before I kind of run through each of them, I've always found that it helps to think about kind of what is the problem we're trying to solve when we think about what are the objectives we're trying to achieve through our work agenda. So let me just spend a quick minute just kind of laying out the problem as I see it. So the first part of the problem is that we are in the middle of, but really we're just in the beginning of a significant change in transition in our generation mix in Victoria. And that's largely driven by two factors. One is government commitment to move to a net zero economy, both at the state level, increasingly at the federal level, but also at the international level, expectations that we are transitioning our economies to a renewable energy generation stock in the future. A second major issue, which is probably even going to be more pertinent and more important in the short to medium term, is that we are also going to be seeing an exit of brown coal generation, which is the mainstay of our generation stock in Victoria, as our generation stock starts to age. And so we've already seen the exit of Hazelwood. There's already been announcements made around the exit of your lawn later this decade, but we expect to see further exit of brown coal generation and therefore the need for renewable energy generation to take its place. So that's the first point. Second point, REZs, as I mentioned, are areas of the state that have got excellent renewable energy resource and are well placed to develop large-scale renewable energy generation in the future. The next issue is that despite them being well placed to be places for renewable energy development in the future, the network in REZs, as in the electricity network in REZs, is often not built to host the significant generation assets that will be required in the future. And that shows itself in a number of ways. One is a lack of capacity in the network for new development, constraints on current generators that are actually operating in REZs at the moment, and also what we call a lack of system strength in the network, which means that new generators take a long time to be able to connect, is costly to connect, and we're not able to necessarily attract in a consistent way generation development in Victoria. The next part of the problem is that we have concerns that the current framework for planning and investment in transmission network in Victoria may not be fit for purpose in this transition that we're talking about. We have concerns that it may not be able to build the capacity in an orderly way to ensure that we have statewide energy security, reliability and affordability in the future. And secondly, our observation from the structure of the framework, but also how we see it playing out in projects such as the Western Vic Transmission Network project, is we have concerns that the framework doesn't adequately engage or take into account community input into the planning process. So that's both bringing community input in earlier on into the planning process to actually help form strategic decisions about where we invest and where we build, but also just in general the level of community engagement required with development of this infrastructure. And then finally, the kind of generation and network development that we're talking about in this energy transition has the potential for local economic development opportunities and substantial local economic development opportunities. But if done in the wrong way, it also has the potential to impact significantly communities within REZs. And so we want to make sure that we are developing a framework that minimises those impacts, leverages those opportunities, and we see the heart of that reform as being how we engage with communities through this process. So given that that's our objective, that's the problem set, these are the objectives that we have. So what we're trying to achieve is an orderly entry and exit of generation to ensure that we still have statewide energy security, reliability and affordability. We want to think about how we strategically coordinate investment, both from a generation and a transmission perspective. And we want to engage with communities to understand how they can benefit from the transition, but also to ensure that any development that occurs is cognizant of their needs and wishes and minimises impact. Catherine, next slide, please. So how are we doing this? This is a schematic of our development work agenda over the last 12 months and also kind of looking forward over the next couple of years. So our work agenda, VicGrid, which is the organisation with which I work, is a newly established body. The division in which we operate is a newly established division. So we really started our work agenda at the beginning of the year. We started it with the development of and release for public consultation of what we call our REZ Development Plan Directions Paper. And what that directions paper did was it included a development plan, which included a number of network assets. Now that development plan was developed in partnership with the Australian Energy Market Operator. And what it essentially did is identify potential network investments in Victoria by 2040, which may be required to help us achieve the energy transition to renewable energy. So that's at the core of what the directions paper did. But what it also did is laid out a two-stage approach to thinking about how we develop REZs in Victoria. So in the first stage, what the directions paper suggested is the establishment of VicGrid initially. So we're, as I mentioned, a newly established body that has been established to actively plan and develop Victorian REZs. And initially, the directions paper gave us responsibility for oversighting potential investments from a $540 million REZ fund, which the Victorian government has established, and also thinking about the development and potential reforms to the Victorian transmission planning and investment framework. The plan identified in those priority in that development plan a number of priority projects which we call stage 1 projects, and those are projects which we suggested would be initial focus for investment out of our $540 million fund. I'll talk a bit about those stage 1 projects shortly and what they are and how we're developing them, but what I would just mention initially is those stage 1 projects are really focused on, I got to consider them remedial projects which attempt to fix current problems on the grid rather than large-scale projects that look at major development or augmentation to the grid in Victoria. So that's stage 1. The next phase of work that the directions paper laid out is it said, beyond the stage 1 projects, we would like to consider potential reforms to the current Victorian transmission planning and investment framework to ensure that we have a robust and sustainable approach to future transmission investment in Victorian REZs. And I'll talk a bit more about what we're looking at in those areas. But as I mentioned, two key things we're thinking about there is the current framework going to actually deliver the network in a way that enables us to transition our generation stock in a kind of orderly way that ensures we still have reliability, security, and affordability, but also does it do it in a way that is cognizant of our community input and needs in the development of both network and generation assets within Victorian REZs. The paper asks for feedback on the stage 1 projects. It asks for feedback on potential reforms to the transmission and planning investment framework and the broader approach that we are applying here, and that's laid out here. We held a number of public and industry forums early in the year and received a large number of written submissions to our directions paper, we have appreciated those and have considered them, particularly in the development of the reforms we're thinking about to the planning and investment framework. Catherine, next slide, please. So let me talk about stage 1 projects first. So as I mentioned, the directions paper identified a number of stage 1 projects for initial investment from the $540 million REZ fund. The stage 1 projects identified in the directions plan really focused on 3 categories. So one was investments in system strength, which aim to provide a cost-effective way for allowing generators to connect to the grid. The second is minor network upgrades, which look to address constraints that current generators currently operating on the grid have in getting their energy to market. And 2 larger line upgrade projects in the Western Vic Transmission Network Project Uprate project, a bit of a tongue tie, and the Mortlake Turn-In project. Next slide, please, Catherine. So in terms of the stage 1 projects, in August, the government announced procurement processes for 6 system strength and minor augmentation projects across Victoria. This is a map of the 6 projects that were identified across the Victorian REZs. In the Western REZ, the focus was on procuring system strength services to enable the cost-effective and timely connection of up to 600 megawatts of new renewable energy generation capacity within the Western Vic zone. I'll go into talking about system strength projects in a bit more detail shortly, but just an update on where we're at in this process. We have engaged the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, to run the procurement process for the system strength and the minor augmentation projects, which were announced in August. In terms of the system strength projects, an expression of interest was released to the market in August, and those responses to that expression of interest closed in middle of September. AEMO and DELP are currently in the process of assessing those responses from project proponents with a view to shortlisting proponents through an invitation to tender process, which is likely to go out shortly. And the plan is to be in a position to be able to announce successful projects for these procurement processes in the second quarter of next year. Next slide, please, Catherine. So if the focus of the stage 1 procurement process at the moment in Western Victoria are system strength projects, it might be just worthwhile talking a bit about what they are, essentially. So what system strength is and what are the types of projects we're talking about when we're thinking about procurement of system strength projects. So system strength is an essential service on the electricity network that determines how securely a system can operate in a safe state in the event that you have an unexpected fault or outage in the system. Now, parts of the network that do not have synchronous generation, which is a technical term for effectively generation such as coal and gas that has kind of large rotating turbines, may not have strong system strength. In addition to that, the connection of generation, which is inverter-based, which is effectively renewable energy generation such as wind and solar, can further decrease the level of system strength. And so if you find a decrease, either low or decreasing system strength, the issue is that in the event of an unexpected fault or outage, the system may not be able to operate in a steady state, and effectively it will shut down and you will find rolling outages occurring. So it's an important service to provide on the network, and what we are effectively doing through our procurement process is providing this service to the network in the Western Victoria is providing a service to enable up to 600 megawatts of renewable energy generation to connect to the Western Vic REZ in a safe way. And it's allowing, therefore, the connection process associated with that generation connection to occur in a quick and cheap and painless fashion. Next slide, please. What I might do is just kind of over the next couple of slides, just talk about what are the types of technologies that can provide system strength and what effectively they look like. So I'll show two examples. The key thing I want to emphasize, but in both of these examples is, as you'll see, these projects are small in scale and they're also situated in an environment that is already part of the network. And so they will be situated in terminal stations, substations, or connection points that already exist for current renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy generation. So this first example of a system strength project is what's called a synchronous condenser. The picture here is some synchronous condenser units situated. Sorry, I just got a call coming in. Let me turn that off. Two synchronous condenser units situated at the Darling Port Solar Farm in New South Wales. What essentially these are large spinning machines that provide voltage regulation, inertia, and short current services into the grid. Next slide, please, Catherine. This is another example of a potential system strength project. What this is a grid forming inverter attached to a battery storage system. These types of solutions are kind of newer solutions on the network. Excuse me. A lot of them are really kind of at the moment at the trialling stage. This is an example of a trial which is occurring at the Dalrymple substation in South Australia. What essentially this technology provides is local voltage and frequency services to the grid, and therefore kind of providing broader system strength services. The really interesting thing about this potential technology is that when you have storage systems connected to grid forming inverters and you potentially oversize the size of the storage system, you can actually have one unit that provides both system strength services as well as energy services to the grid as well. Next slide. Thank you, Catherine. Just quickly note that, as I mentioned, we're in procurement process for system strength projects in the Western REZ. One of the things we're really cognizant of more broadly in our REZ development work agenda is thinking about how we gain local economic development opportunities associated with investment in the grid. One of the ways we're doing it through this current procurement process is to ensure that the government's social procurement framework and local jobs first policy applies to the procurements, which will ensure that we have a strong amount of local content in the projects which are ultimately chosen through the procurement process, and that the projects also provide benefit to disadvantaged groups. Next slide, please, Catherine. As I mentioned, the third set of projects in stage one are two larger line upgrades. This includes the Western Vic transmission uprate project and the Mortlake turn-in project. I might just, I realise I'm kind of going a bit over time, so let me quickly turn to the Western Vic upgrade project because that's probably of most relevant for discussion today. Next slide, please, Catherine. So what this slide here is a schematic of the current Western Vic transmission network project, which is currently being developed by AusNet Services. So what it essentially involves is the construction of a new line that runs from Bulgana to Sydenham Terminal Station in Melbourne. And the new line has a number of different components. So there is a new 220 kV double circuit line running from Bulgana to a new terminal station, which is planned to be developed north of Ballarat. And then the terminal station transforms the voltage to 500 kV, and there's a new 500 kV line that runs from the terminal station north of Ballarat to the Sydenham terminal station. As I mentioned, this project is currently being planned for by AusNet Services. It might just be important for me to be clear about who are the different parties involved in this project at the moment. So AusNet Services is the project proponent, is responsible for planning and developing the project. AMO is the system planner who ran the investment test for the project and awarded the contract to AusNet Services and will oversight any final investment decisions made around the project. And the Victorian government's role in the project is that it is responsible for undertaking the or oversighting the environmental effects statement that is involved in the development of the project. Next slide, please, Catherine. So the Western Vic uprate project, which was identified in the directions paper, does a couple of things to the base project, which is currently being developed by AusNet, or suggests a couple of adjustments to that project. And this schematic here tries to outline the changes. So essentially what it does is it replaces the 220 kV line from Bulgana to North Ballarat with a 500 kV line. This effectively increases the capacity for development of renewable energy generation assets in the western part of the project. Importantly, I think there are two important things to note here. One is that it does not affect the eastern part of the project, that is the 500 kV line from north of Ballarat to Sydenham. But what it potentially does is it means that there may not be a need for the development of the terminal station north of Ballarat. However, we would note that there is still the potential for that terminal station to be required at some point in the future, even if the uprate option was to proceed. And that is because that terminal station would be required if a project called the VNI West project, which is a new project looking at a new interconnection between New South Wales and Victoria, is developed under its current scope and route. The main thing to note about the uprate project is that the government has not made any decisions around whether or not it, at this stage, about whether or not it wants to progress the uprate. As I mentioned, it has made some decisions about wanting to proceed to procurement around system strength and minor augmentation projects across some REZs in Victoria. The government has not made a decision about whether or not it wants to progress the uprate. This is a complex project. It's a large project. It involves significant issues about commercial contracting, particularly between three parties. And so the government has not yet made an announcement about whether or not it wishes to continue or to progress the uprate option as an option. Next slide, please, Catherine. So Just wondering if there might be an opportunity now, before I go into the final part of my presentation, which is more focused around the potential reforms to our planning and investment framework in Victoria. I realise I've probably talked quite a lot about the various projects which are being considered in the stage 1 development under our REZ work agenda. I'm happy to take any questions if there are at the moment on those projects. Catherine, you might be helping ask me to see if there's any questions out there.
Yes, I just popped a comment in the Q&A box to let anyone know if they had a question relevant to the stage 1 projects to pop it in now. Nothing's come up as yet, so I'll keep an eye on it, but why don't we continue through to the next slide and I'll let you know if something pops in.
Sure, that sounds good. So let me just talk briefly about the second phase of work, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So as I mentioned, we are considering whether the current planning and investment framework for transmission infrastructure in Victoria is fit for purpose. We asked a number of questions through our directions paper and the feedback around the framework, and the feedback that we've received has really been invaluable. I might just maybe, Catherine, just get you to move to the next slide. So this is kind of an overview of some of the key themes that we received, both through the meetings that we, the engagements that we had on the directions paper, but also through the submission process. And I would note that I think we received was well over 100 submissions to the directions paper. I won't go.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Ben.
Sure.
We have had sorry,
Sure.
We have had a question come in. Can you please elaborate further on the social procurement framework? I am assuming this is related to obtaining social license. Is that something that you want to address now as part of the stage 1, or should we hold off on that one?
Yes, I can talk to that. So the social procurement framework is a framework that the Victorian government has instituted in recent years for significant procurements using government money. And what it effectively does is it requires, as part of evaluation of procurement proposals, it requires proponents to identify how in delivering their procurement they are able to benefit certain social outcomes. And so there are a number of different objectives in the framework. Each procurement is slightly different in terms of which ones it wants to focus on, but they are things like environmental sustainability of products used in the procurement, employment of disadvantaged groups in society, promotion of Indigenous businesses, employment and promotion of young people and apprentices. So what we're trying to achieve through our procurement is of the system strength services is to ensure that any proponents who put forward projects are delivering those projects in a way that can achieve broader social benefits.
Great, thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
That was the only one that's come through right now, so why don't we continue on where you left off?
Great, thank you. So where do I leave off? So this is a it's a list of some of the key thematics that we have identified through the feedback that we received on the directions paper earlier in the year. Now we're in the process of taking this feedback on board and thinking about developing elements of a reform framework for public consultation early next year. So we plan to come out with a consultation paper which identifies areas that we'd like to see reform in the current framework, and how we would like to go about undertaking that, and seeking feedback from stakeholders widely. So we're talking about community stakeholders within REZs, stakeholders within the energy sector, industry partners, etc. So I probably won't go into large amounts of detail about all the issues that we're going to be that we're focusing on at the moment in the development of that consultation paper. But I might just mention two key areas, and then I'm happy to kind of go to broader questions and answers. So I think the first kind of key area that we're thinking about is whether or not the current framework can actually develop the network and generation infrastructure in a coordinated way that actually enables a transition to reliable, cheap and clean energy. And within that, we think that there are potentially a number of different areas in the current framework which are preventing that. And so we are looking at things like, does the regulatory investment test for infrastructure development in Victoria, does it take into account appropriate costs and benefits when thinking about whether or not a project should proceed or not? We're thinking about what's the best way to finance this infrastructure in terms of cost sharing between consumers and project development and project developers. We're thinking about, can the framework help in the coordination of generation alongside network development, in particular how we can use access regimes to our infrastructure to ensure better coordination of generation development, and also what are the roles and responsibilities of different actors in this new framework. In particular, what's the role of ourselves as VicGrid, what is the role of AEMO as the market operator, and what is the role of proponents such as AusNet in the current system provider. Second key issue, which I think I flagged, is and I'm happy for you to go to this next slide if you like, Catherine, because it's probably related to this second point. Looking at the feedback that we have gotten from stakeholders, looking at the framework in more detail, and also seeing how projects such as the Western Vic Transmission project has been planned for and developed, and acknowledging that project has caused a significant amount of community angst with local communities. We think there is a strong opportunity to change the way community engagement occurs in the planning and investment of transmission and generation infrastructure in REZs. I think one of the things that we are particularly interested in understanding, and happy to receive comments here in this forum, but also through the consultation paper when we go out next year on this, one of the things we're really interested in understanding is how do we bring community input really early on in the planning process, so that any projects that come out of the strategic planning process are cognizant of community desires and wishes, and you don't end up with a project that communities find unacceptable. We're really interested in understanding what might be the governance structures around community engagement associated with planning and investment of the network infrastructure and REZs, in particular, what type of formal structures we might want to establish in terms of consultative committees and other things. And in particular, we're really interested in understanding how to actually leverage the benefits associated with development of network and generation assets within REZs. We, as I mentioned, we see this development agenda as providing a lot of potential opportunities for economic development locally, but we want to make sure that we have got a framework in place that ensures that those benefits are captured locally and do go towards achieving some of the objectives that communities have laid out for themselves in terms of economic development and community development. And I might leave it there, Catherine. Happy to take any questions or comments on that, but also I think there's also some other questions which have been sent in earlier.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. So we will now move on to our question and answer session for those of you who are joining live. So if you do have any that you would like to ask, please go ahead and type in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen. But to begin, we're going to go through some of the questions that were, that were submitted in advance of the session, and then we'll move on to live questions. If we run out of time to answer them all, we're more than happy to follow up with a written response for you offline, so don't worry too much about that. All right, so the first question that we've had come in advance is, to give some context first, we need to invest in transmission networks that are reliable, resilient, secure, robust and efficient to support the connection of new wind, solar and hydro generation and smart storage solutions that are waiting to be commissioned. We should be using existing rights of way and augmenting existing assets with smart high voltage direct current or HVDC technology. Not only does this keep lifetime costs down, but it speeds up the time for renewable connections, powering new and exciting industries. So the question is, will VicGrid be exploring the use of HVDC technology, as many countries are, to create resilient transmission backbones from outer REZs to Melbourne's grid? And if not, then why not?
Thanks, Catherine. So I think I might just answer this question by noting that we're probably technology agnostic in terms of how we develop the grid in Victoria. I think the issue is that the decision around the right technical solution really depends upon the system needs and requirements and should be determined on a project by project basis. There are certain benefits associated with HVDC, as noted in that question. It's particularly useful as a kind of long distance point-to-point bulk transfer of power technology, but also it does not allow the connection of multiple generators along its route. And so in some circumstances, it may not be the appropriate technology for the development of the grid. So I think the answer is we are definitely not ruling out the use of HVDC as a technology in the development of the grid in Victoria, but the appropriateness of each technology type really needs to be project by project.
Thanks, Ben. So the next question is, why can't we harness the energy at the heads of Port Phillip Bay, which happens every day of the year?
Thanks for that. So I don't know if I'm currently aware of any investment-ready projects for tidal power within the Port Phillip heads. The one thing I would note is that once again, the development of REZs in Victoria does not preclude the development of large-scale renewable energy generation outside of the designated REZs. It is one part of the broader transition to renewable energy generation, which we will require in Victoria. The one thing I would note at the moment is that tidal power probably has not been developed in a way that is commercially operational in Victoria. In light of the anticipated coal closures that we have in Victoria, we're going to need to ensure that we have cheap reliable and secure renewable energy generation capacity in a timely way. And so we think the development of a portfolio approach where we are developing large-scale generation within our REZs, we are investing in small-scale generation developments such as microgrids and solar PV and commercial generation, investing in new generation types such as tidal power and others is the preferred way to go. And I would suggest that that it's not a case of either or, it's a case of looking to make sure that we are developing a resilient and dependable grid with a wide variety of technology types within it.
Thank you. So the next question is, with battery storage rapidly advancing, do you see a need for large-scale transmission projects and interconnectors, or will microgrids provide better geographic diversity?
I think this probably is a similar answer to the question before, Catherine. Small-scale solutions such as microgrids are certainly going to play a role in the state's energy transition. However, we don't see those solutions as alone as being able to meet the power needs of the state to power our homes and industries and ensure that we have a diverse and robust grid that can deliver energy in a reliable and safe and cheap way. Batteries are definitely going to be useful in terms of complementing large-scale transmission, particularly in terms of ensuring that we gain greater utilisation of our network in the future. And the RDP noted a number of different storage projects that might be important to develop in Victoria in the future. But probably it's a similar answer to previously that we don't see necessarily one solution as being the complete solution for the transition that we require. It's going to be a combination of large-scale renewable energy generation and transmission, coupled with emerging generation technologies, small-scale generation and storage, and ensuring that it is developed across the grid in a way that ensures the grid is reliable and safe.
Thanks, Ben. So the next question we have is, the current alignment of the Western Victoria Transmission Network project was preferred as it reduces the future cost of Kerrang Link. Can you explain why the Western Vic Transmission Network project is not being progressed in parallel with Kerrang Link? If Kerrang Link does not proceed, there are better options for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project.
Thanks, Catherine. The decision on the development of the Western Vic project and Kerrang Link is not something that I'm responsible for. At the moment, that's the responsibility of AIMO as a system planner. The one thing I would note is that the alignment of the Western Vic project as proposed currently was based on a number of factors that were considered through the RIT process. Those factors, one of those factors was the potential development of Kerrang Link, but it also considered other factors such as kind of technical assessments, costs associated with infrastructure provision, as well as consultation with landowners and local communities. The current development of, within the RIT, the preferred option, which is to what the current Western Victorian project is developed to, did consider a scenario that had a deferment of Kerrang Link, and it was still chosen as the preferred option. So I would note that, but in general, AEMO is responsible for the oversight of the RET processes associated with both projects.
Thank you. So the next question that we have is, with cost blowouts on HumeLink, concerns over Marinus Link and the Western Victoria Transmission Network project, it is evident that the current ISP and RET process is flawed. At what point will VicGrid take over the role of transmission planner for Victoria?
Thanks for that. So, as I mentioned, we have, as VicGrid has been established as a new body to plan and coordinate the development of Victoria's REZs. At the moment, it is focused on the oversight of the $540 million REZ fund, as well as the potential kind of reforms to the planning and investment framework, as I've talked about. So no decision has been made about VicGrid taking over transmission planning. As I mentioned, we are looking to go out to consultation early next year around different elements of potential reforms to the framework, which may include options around changes in responsibilities of different parties within the framework. Excuse me. I think I'll just emphasise that what the government seeks to do is to deliver better outcomes for local communities by supporting appropriate transmission network development and development associated with large-scale renewable energy development in Victoria. And we are interested in ensuring that the investment and planning framework in Victoria enables that outcome, and we will be looking to gain community and stakeholders' views on potential reforms to that framework early in the new year.
Thank you. So the next question is, offshore wind farms provide great benefit with minimal socioeconomic and environmental impacts. Why are REZs not defined for high wind offshore regions?
So there definitely are proposals for sizable offshore wind farm developments in Victoria. I think some people on the line may be aware of an announcement earlier this week by the government of $40 million support to support some pre-construction development activities for a Gippsland project. So these projects are going to play an important role in Victoria's energy mix going forward. And the one thing I would emphasise is that REZs do not preclude the connection of offshore wind or the development of offshore wind in Victoria. So particularly in thinking about the planning for and development of our Southwest REZ and our Gippsland REZ, which have the significant coastal shoreline assets, we will definitely be considering how the development of offshore wind should be taken into account. And as I've kind of mentioned in comments before, I think what we expect will occur is that we will need to have a mix of generation types across Victoria, and so we will likely end up through this transition with a mix of both onshore and offshore wind and solar development that ensures that we have the advantage of diversity in our generation stock, ensures that the grid is reliable, and ensures that we have safe and cheap electricity being provided to our households and businesses.
Thank you. So the next question is, network planners currently have no social license to operate. How will VicGrid address this?
So I think I mentioned in my kind of concluding remarks, this is a key element that we think is missing from the current approach to the development of large-scale renewable energy generation and transmission infrastructure. We are particularly interested in understanding how we can engage communities upfront in strategic planning to ensure that projects that come out of that planning process have the social license that they need to be developed and to operate. So we, in terms of how we're thinking of this, we're thinking about how we communicate and improve community knowledge around the REZ development agenda through forums such as this, ensuring that the development of network generation infrastructure is planned for in a strategic way that that includes community engagement very early on in the process, and also importantly how we more broadly ensure that local economic development opportunities associated with infrastructure development are captured. And so, as I mentioned, in the consultation that we're wanting to undertake early next year, we'll be likely putting forward some suggestions about how that might be done. But we are very much interested in seeking views from communities and stakeholders about how best to do that, and definitely no decisions have been made at this point about the direction we'll go, and we'll be guided by the feedback that we receive through our consultation process.
Thanks, Ben. I think we'll have time for one or two more. So the next question is, has any community engagement been done around the projects identified in the development plan?
So in terms of the development plan, so there was community engagement and stakeholder engagement undertaken on the directions paper. So we held a number of industry and regionally based forums earlier in the year and asked for written submissions. The thing that I would note that in terms of the development of projects, there's two things. One is that the stage one projects that we that the government has decided to start procurement processes on are projects that will occur in parts of the network that are already kind of designated for network development. So they will occur, as I mentioned, the System Strength projects. It's clear that those projects will occur at sites such as terminal stations, substations, or connection points. Similarly with the minor augmentation projects, they're works that occur on the network, either in terminal stations or in easements along the network. Any projects that are developed through that procurement process will still need to go through all the relevant planning processes that are required for those types of developments, and that will be expected to be delivered by the project proponents. In terms of the broader projects that were identified in the development plan, obviously we asked for feedback through the directions paper about what are the projects, whether or not those are appropriate projects to consider in terms of future development of the grid. And we've received a large number of comments back through written submissions on those projects. But more importantly, I want to emphasise that we see the further development of projects outside of the stage one projects that have already been identified as occurring through the planning and investment framework for infrastructure development in Victoria. And as I mentioned, we are looking to consider potential reforms to that framework, and those reforms also, one of the key factors we're trying to emphasise in those reforms is how we improve community engagement in the planning and investment processes that occur through that framework. So there's definitely no intention to develop any of the projects identified in the directions paper in a way that is not going to be consistent with good community engagement.
Thanks, Ben. So I think we're just going to do one last question
Sure.
that's come up in the live chat. It's along similar lines to one that you answered not long ago, but slightly different. So the question is, AEMO, the Vic government and related agencies recognise the current RIT and transmission planning framework is not fit for purpose and that reform is needed. So why is policy and framework not being fixed now before projects are developed? Current proposals are adversely impacting communities, and this is not an acceptable burden to expect.
So the intention is, as I mentioned, definitely to look at potential reforms to the framework, and we intend for any projects that are developed in Victoria in the future to occur under that new framework. In terms of projects that are already in place, such as the Western Vic transmission project, that's a project that was planned for, and the investment test and contracting for it occurred under the current framework. I think it is the way that project is being developed, and clearly some of the community concerns around the development of that project are informing the way that we would like to see reforms occur in the framework into the future, to ensure that future projects do not suffer from the same issues.
Thank you, Ben. So that was our final question, and it's now just on 7 p.m. So we'll wrap it up here. So thank you, Ben, for joining us this evening, and thank you to the members of our community who have tuned in to tonight's session and contributed to the discussion. A recording of this session will be made available on our website in the coming days, and I'll make sure that the link to that video goes out to everyone who registered for this evening. If you have any suggestions on topics or agencies that you would like to hear from in relation to the Western Victoria Transmission Network project, please feel free to send us your ideas. And on that note, thank you everyone for joining us. We really hope you found the session valuable and have a great evening.